when we can, close to once a month to talk about making philanthropy a little more community centric. Please be mindful and courteous in the chat. If you have any questions, myself and Emily Blue are on kind of tech duty today. Today is going to be a little more content rich than usually our other meetings are, but we're going to share links to slides and some additional notes, so you have resources and references to everything that we talk about today. Please connect to everyone else in the chat. Turn your camera off if you can. And if you have any accessibility issues, please, me or Emily are the best person to get in contact with. Anything else I missed, Patrice?
Unmute. We're going to just be talking about DAFs. There's a lot of information here. We want you to be able to follow along in whatever way makes sense for your learning. So if you need to just listen and look at something to the side, that's fine. If you like the slides and want to focus on that, that's fine. We want to make sure you can access this information wherever and whenever you need to post this, because it preps us for our next session, which is really getting into, is there something we can do about some of the problems that we're going to discuss today related to donor advised funds? And so we want to make sure you have time to share your thoughts and questions with us, and those will roll over to how the next session is presented in November. And we do have a date for that, and that's at the end of the slides. Megan, I want you to do this part too, since you designed it.
Okay. We like to have a little fun check-in question. So on a scale to all of these jack-o'-lanterns on the screen, how are you coming into this space today? Are you excited? Are you feeling a little mischievous? Or are you kind of spilling your guts a little bit? I'm going to speak for myself personally. I'm definitely a 7 or a 9.
I love them. I love them so much. And we do have a bit of a Halloween theme going in some of our, I have my Halloween shirt on today. You guys can think about what jack-o'-lantern you are for the rest of the day.
What kind of jack-o'-lantern are you based on the faces? Yep.
Okay, we're gonna get into it. Again, welcome. I'm gonna move my chat over here in case I need to see something. I am Patrice. I'm one of the planning team members of More Than Grant Writers. Started with this group back when we were launching at this time last year at the Grant Professionals Summit. We just showed up and started talking to other grant professionals to see, hey, what do we care about? What kinds of things can we do together to make philanthropy and grant writing and the nonprofit space more equitable? And so we've had a lot of different presentations over the last year, and this time we're talking about donor advised funds. My background is in social work. I have over 19 years of experience working in social services and nonprofit organizations, and I have a small nonprofit consulting business called A Village for Good. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to see you. That picture of me there, it's kind of a weird picture, but I'm showing off my skeleton earrings that I'm not wearing today because they're a little bit distracting, but they're my fave. So quick acknowledgement, I am not a DAF or a financial expert. This is something that I've been researching for a few months now because of the relationship I have to dollars in the philanthropy space and my curiosity around it. This information was compiled through conversations with philanthropic advisors, community foundations, and research from a range of sources. I've been talking to a lot of people, asking a lot of questions to see what comes from all of the different sides of where this money exists. There will be a lot of information presented today. If it gets to be too much, feel free to step away. Again, you'll get the recording. If you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat along if we go. If I need to stop somewhere, just like raise your hand or come off mute and let me know, because I'll just keep going through to make sure we have time at the end for some of the bigger questions to cover. out of curiosity, before we get into the polls that we're about to do, in the chat, can you guys let us know if you've been to any of our sessions before or if you're brand new here, because we've been showing up in a lot of different places and have met some new faces. So I'd love to see how many folks are new versus how many folks have come to our sessions before. A lot of new people. That's exciting. Okay, cool. A lot of new folks. Well, welcome. We're glad you're here. We do informational sessions and calls to action. Usually about once a month. We took a little bit of time over the summer. So once you're on our list, it'll keep you up to speed. And we also do a lot of other really wonderful resources to keep people tapped into what's going on with these conversations about philanthropy and grant work and other nonprofit and development type things. So we're glad you're here. All right, so we have a couple of poll questions to get a feel for where everybody is. So those are up on your screen right now. Let us know if you can't see them. We have 3 questions that we're starting off with, so we're going to go through those. And really quickly, as you guys are answering them, have y'all seen the new Beetlejuice movie? I watched it over the weekend. I was a little disappointed. Has anyone else seen it? I loved the first one. This one was a little out there. You liked it? Lauren liked it. Betty was a little disappointed. It was disjointed, right? Like the lady that sewed herself together, I feel like that could have just not existed at all. Oh, okay. Okay, so first question, how much do you know about DAFs? Unfamiliar, familiar, expert. So 66% so far, pretty familiar. 30% unfamiliar. Ooh, we have a couple experts. You guys might need to have to join in on the session and help out. Based on what do you know, how do you feel about them? Great, okay, indifferent, uneasy, highly worried. Okay, okay, okay. You guys can see the results, not just me, right? Everyone can see. Okay. What size organization do you work in? 0 to 1 million, 19%, 1 to 5, 40% more. Okay. I was really curious about that one, and I'm so most people are in medium to large size organizations, it looks like. So this is especially relevant for you. Oh, someone says cannot see. I don't know how to make that happen. Emily, can you see the results?
I can, but as a co-host, I can't see what non-hosts can see. But can people give a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you can see it? Okay, that might have just been lagging.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Stuck on the second question. Okay, folks are figuring that out. So to recap the poll, most folks today are kind of familiar, couple of experts. There's 30% who are unfamiliar with DAFs. Most people feel indifferent or uneasy, still learning, trying to figure it out. A couple people are highly worried. A couple of people feel great about them. Most of the organizations are over $1 million budget, pretty equal between 1 to 5 and more than $5 million. Okay. Oh, I can push that. I don't know if that did anything. I'm going to close that. Okay. All right, here we go. DAF 101. So we're going to start with the basics. So for those of you who are experts or know a fair amount, you can kind of maybe tune out for just a second. We're going to get through some of the basics to then get into some of the less basic stuff and into how these things relate to grant work. A donor advised fund is a charitable giving vehicle where donors contribute assets that can be cash, stocks, real estate, etc., and receive an immediate tax deduction. Funds are granted to eligible nonprofit organizations. Very simply. DAFs were created in the 30s, but they weren't regulated until the Tax Reform Act of 1969. We have that we don't have that act linked into the things. We have the Pension Protection Act. But the term donor advised fund wasn't codified in the tax code until the Pension Protection Act of 2006. And there was popularity that started in the 90s. And in the last decade or so, there has been a significant jump in the trends around donor advised funds. So we're going to talk about those. So very simply, what goes into a donor advised fund? Well, cash, appreciated securities, other appreciated assets. They're becoming popular because people can put assets that are difficult to liquidate into a donor advised fund, and that's handled on the financial side of it. And they get a pretty significant tax deduction on the income on the assets that are going into that fund. So donors can deduct up to 60% of their adjusted gross income for cash donations, 30% of appreciated assets like stocks and bonds and mutual funds. And I'm pretty sure cryptocurrency can also be a part of this as well. And then 30%, capped at 30% for other types of appreciated assets like property and private business interests. And then they can be invested, the money can be invested within the fund, and it can grow. And that is also untaxed growth on the investment returns. So DAFs are managed by a sponsor organization, which has to be a 501c3 public charity, and they manage and administer the donor advised fund. So their primary role is the custodians of the fund, and they manage the assets on behalf of the donors. The donors tend to advise where they want the money to go, but legally, once the money is in the fund, it's up to the sponsor to ensure that transaction is following all the guidelines. So examples of sponsors are community foundations, financial institution affiliated charities, Fidelity, Schwab, Morgan Stanley. They all have 501c3 arms that manage these donor advised funds. Even foundations can manage donor advised funds. So they get revenue on administrative fees for managing the fund, and it tends to be 0.5 to 2% that's taken out of the fund. Sponsor organizations tend not to provide charitable services, even though they're a 501c3, just like the 501c3s that we work with. They focus on managing and growing and distributing the funds. They're responsible for ensuring that all of the regulations are followed. They are filing the 990 based on the money that's coming in and going out. Most interactions, and this part is important for all of us on this side of the money, go through the DAF sponsor, not the DAF donor themselves, not the family, not the individual, not the business that created the fund. If we are seeking and trying to steward different or get relationships going for these access to these kinds of funds, we need to be thinking about the institutions, the organizations that are managing these funds as the sponsors, not really the people that are putting the money into it. So who puts money into a DAF? Individuals, families, businesses, typically high net worth individuals who want an efficient way to manage their charitable giving. At this point, still primarily white donors. So as far as philanthropy goes, we're still keeping the money in the same group of people that have held that wealth, held that philanthropic dollars all along the way. It's not a very diverse space for funds. Contributions are irrevocable. So once the money goes in, they can't take it out for their own personal use afterward. They get that immediate tax deduction when they put the money in, and it doesn't matter when the money comes back out. They get the benefit right away. It can sit there forever if they want it to. Money comes out of a fund typically when a donor tells their sponsor, I want to send X number of dollars to this 501c3 charity or for this cause. The sponsor organization has to approve and distribute the funds, and the final say does lie with the sponsor, not the donor, but they're going to follow what the donor wants. Otherwise, they will lose them as an account that they're managing. Okay, so those are the basics. Are there any questions really quickly about the basics? Or is there anything anybody wants to add? Any of our experts want to add anything? The next question is, who can tell me what episode from Friends this clip of Joey comes from? Anybody? I'm sure someone knows. Come on. The one with, yes, they all start with the one. Yes, when he's teaching an acting class at the community college and he's showing them how he acts like he's confused about something. So there you go. Okay, so we're going to get into some of the regulations and the benefits of donor advised funds. As far as regulations go, there aren't a lot, which is one of the criticisms of donor advised funds, and we'll get into some of that a little bit later. But the sponsor organization is legally responsible for managing the fund. All the funds must be exclusively used for charitable purposes, and the sponsor organization makes the final decision on which grants to approve. I did stop and ask when I was talking with people at Community Foundation specifically, I asked, hey, does your organization set any kind of boundaries that you all follow to make sure funds aren't going to things like hate groups or places that cause harm? And the response I get was, we'll look into what a donor has asked us to put money into, and we'll go back to them and say, did you know that this is going to this? And usually they do know where they want it to go. And they said, legally, we have no reason not to do that. So again, we'll talk a little bit about those kinds of concerns later on in the presentation. So grants, they call them grants. The money that comes out of the fund are called grants, but not in the way that we know grants. And they can only be made to qualified 501c3s and other eligible charities like religious institutions. Grants to individuals are not allowed. For the prohibited uses, DAF funds cannot be used for personal benefit, such as fulfilling a pledge, purchasing event tickets, or providing a donor with other benefits like membership or goods. This is also really important in us understanding how donor advised funds can benefit our organization. So an example of what can't happen is if you are having an event and somebody wants to sponsor your event through their donor advised fund, they can do that, but it can't do that if they're going to receive a benefit for that sponsorship. So maybe their sponsorship comes with 12 tickets to your event. They can still use their donor advised fund if they want, but they cannot receive the benefit that comes with that. So they can't come use those tickets as it's linked to their donor advised fund. That money would need to come out of some other account. So that's something interesting to keep in mind if you're in a development role and figuring out where DAFs fall into that. There is no mandatory payout rate. So private foundations, like we all know, have a 5% payout rate of their assets annually. DAFs are not subject to a payout rate, though some data shows that payout for active used donor advised funds are 20 to 25%. And that's one of the things that a lot of people who are pro-DAF and working in that space talk about a lot, that more money is coming out of donor advised funds than other types of charitable giving places. Sponsor organizations can establish their own internal policies encouraging disbursements. I did talk to people who said, we have a policy that if no money has come out of the DAF in 3 years, then we'll reach out to the donor and start talking to them about moving some money in some charitable ways. Easy question. Is there any conflict of interest? Firewall between the donor and the receiving 501c3, or does the sponsor have responsibility to monitor and mediate that? The sponsor does. It's up to them to make sure that the money is going to an eligible 501c3. And what I've seen happen is a donor might say, hey, I want money to go to here. The sponsor will reach out to somebody at that organization saying, can you provide us your IRS letter? Can you provide us this? Can you provide us that before the check actually comes? And there's a lot of different ways those kinds of interactions happen. Oh, whoops, go back. Neither donors nor related parties can receive any direct or indirect benefit from the DAF, such as satisfying our personal pledge, like we talked about on the other slide. Family members and disqualified persons. This is also different from, oh, Tara, I see your hand. I'll get you in just a second. This is also different from foundations in that part of that 5% can encompass a whole lot of things that benefit the people at the foundation and the people who have started the foundation. So foundations can charge, they can pay for family to be their staff, and that goes toward their 5%. Foundations can bring all of their family and board members to Hawaii for their annual meeting, and that can come out of their 5% assets every year. No person that's on, well, no person, no individuals specifically, but families or individuals that start a donor advised fund cannot benefit from the funds in that once it's there, it's for charitable purposes. They can't work around that kind of like foundations do sometimes. Go ahead, Tara.
Thank you. Just going back to the purchasing of gala tickets, for example, is it something that, for example, someone with a DAF could purchase a table at a gala and not benefit from that themselves, but say give those tickets to wealthy friends or clients, sort of indirectly benefiting from that money? Or is that not a loophole?
Yeah, I mean, there's some gray areas, and I think it would be left up to what the sponsor is probably defining as a benefit to the person. So I can't say, I mean, I could see someone saying, hey, we're not going to use the tickets. Feel free to donate them to anybody else who wants to come to the event. And that might be okay. But if they're like, hey, we're not going to come, but I want to give it to all my family members,
Yeah.
right, that might get a little bit. But you know, when you're thinking about tax deductions for people, for things like events and ticketed events, you know, when I was just working with this with an organization that was doing their annual thing, and the CRM that they have, we were kind of trying to figure out what letter was going to come out to the people that were doing their sponsorships, telling them what their tax deduction was for that. And it was really difficult to calculate because we were supposed to calculate the cost of the ticket,
Sure, minus the benefit. Yeah.
right? And so when it is something like that, it gets into a gray area, and I think it would probably be up to the sponsor to determine what those definitions
Okay.
are.
But ultimately it rests with the sponsor. There's not like legislation that,
No one is policing it.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, were there any questions in the chat I needed to? It's kind of off to the side. Someone speak up if I've missed something. I'm gonna keep going. So what are the benefits of donor advised funds? From a community foundation that I talked to, their quote was, DAFs allow maximum involvement in grant making while streamlining the giving process. And I thought this statement was really interesting because the way we understand grant making, right, is very different than what happens through donor advised funds, which again is why we're having this conversation today with development people, with grant professionals, because some of the terms might be changing, right? Grant making as we know it is not what is coming out of donor advised funds. So we need to be ready and prepared for what sort of terms and definitions are happening, so that we are informed on what those mean for all of us. So for the donor themselves, what's the benefit? It's an immediate tax deduction, regardless of when the grants were made. They can grow the fund tax-free. They can grow it for a long time to plan to hand it off to a family member down the line, another generation, to keep wealth adjacent to the family, right? Like they still can't benefit from it. But I talked to a lot of people who said they start these things so that their children will grow into understanding charitable giving. There's flexibility in timing for making the grants to charities. There's no regulation when they do it, so they can choose whenever they want. And they can have anonymity in their donations if they desire. And a lot of people do desire that. And that's another thing we'll talk about pretty soon. So the benefit for the sponsor is it creates assets for them to manage, and that is the way that they make money in the model that they have. It can align with their mission by supporting donors' philanthropic goals. A lot of times community foundations are taking that stance that they want to be involved in the work that's going on in the community and can help people move their dollars into those causes that are making a positive impact. And then it just creates those long-term relationships with philanthropists, right? And I did talk to, there's all kinds of positions in these financial institutions. There's philanthropic advisors, there's financial advisors, and those are very different roles. There's kind of brokers of people who maybe your donor advised fund is with us, but you have some other philanthropic goals and other accounts that are with another company, and then we communicate. So it gets a little bit complex on that side. Based on some of the information that I was given from folks that have those roles. What are the benefits for the recipients, for the nonprofit organizations? Well, not a ton of research has been done on the benefits for nonprofits. It mostly focuses on the benefits for the sponsor organizations and the DAF sponsors. And this was especially apparent when the IRS, their proposed regulations, they had open comments, and the comments that were received were very heavily focused on it's easy and flexible for the funder, for the donor, which then ultimately gets more money in the community, right? It wasn't really focused on the benefit to the community, on the benefit to the nonprofit organization. But it can reduce administrative burden. So we all know what it takes to submit grant application after grant application after grant application. And that doesn't typically happen this way. Maybe there's some relationships, maybe there's stewarding some people here and there. But a lot of times what happens is a financial sponsor or a sponsoring organization, somebody there knows about something, informs their client of it, and decides to give money that way. And then the money just kind of comes in the door. I've worked with organizations where checks show up and they don't know what it is. And so there's not a ton of administrative time spent on trying to access these dollars yet. But as people are realizing the trend going on, I think the way we work around them is going to start to change. Allows organizations to benefit from funds that were previously complex assets. There are organizations that can say, yes, we'll take your stocks. Yes, we can handle any assets that are really difficult and complex, but there's a lot that can't. So once the stuff goes into the donor advised funds, it gets liquidated and then it comes out as cash for the nonprofit, which is a benefit to be able to utilize more assets for public good. Okay. I'm going to pause right here. Are there any questions that I need to catch up in the chat, or does anybody want to make a comment or ask a question about the information so far? Yeah, Emily, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually have a question about reporting requirements. Can a DAF require like a report at the end of the year the way that a foundation can?
Yeah, so sponsors are responsible for creating the 990. And we'll talk in a little bit about one of the concerns related to that is they don't have to break it out per DAF, they aggregate that data. And so it's really difficult to see specifically what's going on. You just get, so if Morgan Stanley is creating a report, their 990 of the money that's come out and all of the finances that happened in there, you can't see all of the funds that they have. And you can't see who started those funds. So it creates this kind of dark trail of money that can get a little bit sketchy. But I just found something on Instrumental I'm going to show you guys in a little bit, and I didn't even realize it till yesterday. So it's exciting news. Oh, thanks, Donna. Okay. So we're going to get into the trend. DAFs being the buzzword. So from there was a Schwab Lilly Family Foundation report that was put out in 2020, and it's linked in the outline for you all to be able to read if you want. They say more donors have DAFs, more charitable dollars are flowing into those funds, more dollars are flowing from these funds to nonprofits, and the funds hold greater assets now than ever before. All of these factors indicate that DAFs will play an increasingly important role in the philanthropic landscape in years to come. And I think if you talk to anybody that's been looking at this, nobody's going to disagree with that. So let's look at the numbers. I know there's a lot of information on this page, and so I'm glad you all have it and can look at it in another place and refer back to it. So DAFs are a $230 billion market that has been expanding exponentially over 20% on average per year over the last 5 years. Contributions to DAFs reached $85.53 billion in 2022, representing a 9% increase from the previous year. Grants from DAFs to charitable organizations also rose, totaling $52.16 billion, another 9% increase from 2021. And it was the first time that DAF grants surpassed $50 billion. The number of DAF accounts, this one blows my mind, you guys. There were approximately 180,000 DAF accounts in 2010. By 2023, there were 1.95 million accounts, representing a 975% increase in a decade. Man. Charitable assets. In 2012, the assets held in DAFs were approximately $45 billion. By 2022, they were 228.89 billion, a growth of over 400%. In 2012, grants from DAFs amounted to around 9 billion. By 2022, grants reached 52.16 billion, marking an increase over 480%. So money's going in, money is coming out. 52 billion versus 230 billion. I think there could probably be some more movement there, and we'll talk a little bit about that moving on. Anything about some of these numbers that anybody wants to say anything about? I don't want to move to, just let it all sink in. And Angelica, wow, I know. Every time I write these down, I'm just like, 975%. That's so let's math some things, right? Because when you look up what is a typical amount in a DAF fund, you get really weird information because there's a lot of outliers. There is no minimum amount for a DAF fund. There is a minimum amount that makes sense if you're going to have that fund and get a benefit and have to pay administrative fees on. Some community foundations I talked to said they start at $10,000. People have to put at least that much in to get going because it doesn't make sense financially otherwise. But it's a really good opportunity for people who don't want to start a family foundation, who don't have the money to start a family foundation, but still want some untaxed charitable dollars to use in some of the things that they care about. So if there's $230 billion and you divide that by 1.95 million accounts, that comes out to about $118,000 per account. That's not really what happens. It doesn't work out that evenly because you have people that have lots of money in accounts. And it's not unusual for people with a lot of wealth to have multiple DAF accounts, right? They might start one for each of their children or something like that. Or start them in different places depending on what their goals are and fees and things they can get from the different sponsors that are holding those funds for them. But some data does show the average grant size from a DAF, so the money going to the organization at a time, is $4,800, with the median grant size being $1,000. So it's still a little bit more than probably your individual donors coming in one by one to your organization. $4,800 a pop, not a bad place to start thinking about your funding strategy in relation to these. Like I said, there's no required amount to start those DAFs. So let's compare some things. In 2023, foundation giving contributed to approximately $103.5 billion to charitable organizations, representing about 21% of all charitable donations in the US. Now, we all know when we're looking at the charitable giving pie, the biggest chunk comes from individuals, right? And we're always telling our clients and people who want to get into grant writing, it's not always the most significant part of your organization's budget. Because from foundations, when we're pulling out government money, right, when we're just looking at private money, foundations and trusts, about 20% of the charitable giving that goes on an annual basis. And it can look like it's increasing from one year to the other, but when you adjust for inflation, we're actually seeing a decrease in the money coming from those private funds that are designated for charitable purposes. And I think that's really important when we're looking at DAFs and foundations side by side. And this chart shows the increase of those donor advised funds over the year and how things are kind of always sort of level up and down just a little bit through those foundations. Also, to go along with the trend, it's getting easier for people to use their DAF. It's getting easier for people to figure out how money goes from one place to the other, which was a challenge before. You had to go through steps. You had to go through a sponsor. There was different transaction stuff happening. But now people are creating DAF buttons for your website, for your organization, companies that are making that transaction easier for the donor, easier for the sponsor so that the money can come in faster. Other solutions are coming up. There's a company now called DAFI that it's basically all mobile. So like they're the sponsor, they're holding the money. And I can say, oh, there's a weather-related disaster going on. I want to send money to the American Red Cross to help something, put it on my phone. That transaction can happen really quickly. So we're going to see those types of solutions pushed a lot more, capturing the trend of the money going into these accounts. There's also a push that I'm hearing when I'm asking other groups on the financial side to educate nonprofits to educate their donors to use a donor advised fund, right? So including that in the information you're providing to current donors, prospective donors, making sure they know donor advised funds are a way that they can give money to your organization. And one of the people I was talking to at Schwab said one of her most favorite things to do, and she tends to direct donors to this charity, is the American Cancer Society, because how dedicated they are to making sure people who are giving to their organization know how they can use their donor advised fund, and their website lists out really well how money like that can be used. The 10th, October 10th was the first ever DAF day. So there's a company called Chariot. They're the one that created the DAF button, and they hosted and launched DAF Day to encourage more people to learn about DAFs and use them for their charitable giving. And I have a link here to some of the initial reporting that they found in the money that was used charitably through donor advised funds on that day. Now, leading up to DAF Day, they had like 2 or 3 months of informational webinars for people who wanted to learn more about DAFs. And of course, they were all very rosy, very DAF positive kinds of things with people from organizations like Susan G. Komen and all of these giant organizations that have the ability to figure out how DAFs fit into their organization and have staff dedicated to donor advised funds and creating those sorts of relationships. And they were on one of them, they were talking about this report, and it made me laugh out loud, talking about like the benefits of this and how people are engaging and using these dollars. And the report was about 20 organizations, 20. That was all that was included in this report. And 16 of those organizations had budgets over $10 million. And so when we're thinking about the organizations here that are under $10 million, right, and the resources that we can put toward figuring out how to access these funds, there's a bit of a gap there. And when you start to hear pro-DAF people, they're forgetting about most of the organizations with budgets under $1 million in the United States, right? So just another thing, one of those concerns that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then growth of financial sponsors. So these large financial firms like Fidelity and Schwab and Morgan Stanley dominate the DAF sponsor market. So they hold way more of these assets than community foundations do. And they are the people in the middle of those funds. And one of the questions I have is what qualifies them to help people understand the impact that their dollars are making through these funds? Are they connected to their communities? Do they connect with people doing the work? Are they able to share real, accurate information about what the needs of the community are? And spoiler alert, the answer is probably no, or not very often at least. So there's a lot of startup organizations that are looking to create tech solutions to the way this money is transacted. And there's some more things you guys can look into there. All right, so before we get into the concerns, I know it's been a lot of information. People need like a quick break. Are we good? Let me know in the chat how you're feeling, how it's going, if there's anything we need to stop and go back over. Let me know if you're ready to move forward. Give me like a thumbs up or a yay or like one of those emoji things. I don't want so much that it just falls out of your brain. Okay, 2 people said go, so I'm gonna keep going. So now we're getting into the concerns. And there's concerns, friends. So if you don't already follow inequality.org, I recommend you do. If you want something in your inbox that makes you really mad about the wealth distribution in our country and in our world, it's a great place to start. But they do a lot of really wonderful research and reporting. They're based out of the Institute of Policy Studies. And I actually reached out to the people there and I was like, yeah, you want to come talk on our thing? And nobody got back to me, but that's how that works. Interestingly, the guy, Chuck Collins, is the managing editor of inequality.org. And when I was looking up a little bit more, I learned that he was an heir to the Oscar Mayer fortune. And that's how he got into understanding just these incredible wealth inequities and disparities. So that's a little bit of trivia for you there. And their report, thanks Emily, is the true cost of billionaire philanthropy. And they say, we have no nationwide data on the payout rates of individual DAF accounts because sponsors are not required to report them. Instead, we have to rely on the aggregate rates reported by industry providers or the sponsors themselves, which can be inflated through questionable calculation methods, such as dividing current year contributions by the organization's average assets over the previous 5 years. So what ends up happening is when you're looking for data and when you're getting information from these sponsors and financial institutions, the way they report it can be up to them in some regard, right? Like they still have to fill out a 990, they still have to follow those IRS regulations, but there's some interpretation that they put into the information that they're sharing. And then the people that are wanting to further this DAF industry are taking the bits and pieces that they like, and they're really spreading those to make it seem like this is the new way of philanthropic giving. So this chart shows us the top 20 US charities receiving contributions in 2021. All of the orange bars, because I know it's really small text, are sponsor organizations, financial institutions, and all of the teal bars are working charitable organizations in the United States. So you can see in 2021, most of the money that exists going toward 501c3s is going into donor advised funds. Wow. We also know that some foundations are diverting funds to donor advised funds, which also count toward their 5%. So they can move money from their foundation account into a donor advised fund or multiple donor advised funds, and they can count that toward their charitable assets that go into the community. We also know, and I heard this from all of the community foundations that I talked to, and they said it just kind of casually as just point of information, that foundations that they help manage under their community foundation umbrella are transferring their assets to donor advised funds because of the administrative burden of having a foundation. And so they're realizing I can still have a say in where my charitable dollars go through a donor advised fund. I don't have to spend time and money managing a foundation and following the regulations that go along with that account. There's also concerns about reduced accountability and money staying within the financial system instead of reaching nonprofits. So DAF to DAF money, right? One DAF can send money to another DAF. And it's really difficult to see that in real time and to understand what's happening from account to account. So they can tell us that 50 whatever million dollars is going out, but it could just be going to another donor advised fund, not an actual working nonprofit organization. The concern is that money going to DAFs, money's going into DAFs instead of the community. So a few things from the true cost of billionaire philanthropy report is DAFs are used as tax shelters with very few regulations. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. Recent studies indicate that many DAF accounts payout rates are abysmally low. The Council, I'm sorry, it's blocking my thing. The Council on Michigan Foundations found that in 2018, the median payout rate of the 2,600 DAF accounts administered by the Michigan's community foundations was 3.1%. So not the 20 to 25% that some data is showing coming out of these accounts. And that 37% of those accounts didn't pay out any money to charity at all in any given year. California Attorney General's office reported that from 2016 to 2020, 42% of California's community foundation DAF accounts paid out less than 5% in any given year. So again, when you're getting data on money coming out of these, it's really important for us to be curious about where that data came from and wonder who is benefiting from that data being shared. A significant amount of DAF grants go to other DAFs. They found 2.5 billion in grants going from national donor advised funds to other national donor advised funds in 2021 alone. Another concern is the anonymity and the intention behind it. So DAF donors can remain anonymous. and they do. If you are at an organization and you receive money through a donor advised fund, they can name that fund whatever they want. They can keep it in their name. They can give it whatever random name they want. Oftentimes, not often, I've seen they name it something foundation, which gets really confusing because then a check comes in and a client comes to me and says, hey, we got this money. And I say, hey, I didn't write a grant for that. I don't know where that came from. And then we have to dig around and figure out what foundation it actually came from when it was a donor advised fund, but we couldn't tell. And there was a report that said 52% of organizations that received a gift from a DAF said that they received an anonymous gift. So it's definitely something that we're seeing, something that we have to understand exists. DAFs are typically suggested by a financial advisor for tax benefits rather than requested by a person to increase their charitable giving. So this is something that I've been hung up on for a while, and understanding the intention of the money. Is the person putting the money into a DAF coming into it saying, I have money I want to go into a community. I have money I want to create a positive impact. I have money that I want to go to a working nonprofit organization. Or is it the other way around, where they have money that needs somewhere to go, and their financial person, their tax person, their philanthropic person is saying, hey, you have some money. Why don't we move it into this account? You can decide where you want it to go in the community, and then you get this tax benefit on it. So even psychologically, people are not primed to be ready to support causes and their community, because the way they're thinking about that money comes from a very different intention to begin with. A disproportionate amount of gifts go to larger organizations rather than smaller organizations. I think we can all understand why that is. And dollars can go toward harm. And I don't get too much into this topic that we can talk about in our second session, but I have, okay. Quick little thing about this clip I'm about to show you. I was watching John Oliver and it popped up on my TV and I recorded it from my phone. So the audio is a little bit low. Turn up your volume if you need to, but I wanted to show you this because this came on like a week or two ago and I was like, oh my gosh, we're talking about DAFs. I have to show this clip. Is everybody ready? Everybody's volume's up? Because it's just a little quick thing.
From a student club into an incubator and pipeline for conservative lawyers to become public officials and judges. Leo's also a hugely successful fundraiser and has built a dark money network to funnel cash to conservative causes, groups, and politicians. And he's used a number of tactics over the years to conceal the movement of that money. In terms of where it ends up, he's recently been using what are called donor-advised funds, which make it practically impossible to trace where the money goes. And in terms of where it comes from, which does feel important, many entities he's been linked to haven't been required to disclose their donors. And as you'll see here, when asked about that, he can get cagey fast.
Can you describe to us what the purpose of the BH fund is? BH fund is a charitable organization. You can look it up, but I'm sure its statement of purpose is listed.
We did. Its tax document says its mission is to promote the rule of law and limited constitutional government. And it received $24 million from an anonymous donor in 2017.
I have a very simple rule, which is I'm engaged in the battle of ideas, and I care very deeply about our Constitution and the role of courts in our society. And I don't waste my time on stories that involve money and politics, because what I care about is ideas.
Oh, come on.
Okay. If you start to look into some of the harms of donor advised funds, which we will not dive into in this session, you will find that money from these funds is being used for very specific purposes to move very specific agendas in very specific directions. And while it's not designed for that, right? No one is going to say that donor advised funds were created for this dark, horrible money and where it can go. It does, and it has to be something that we recognize is part of the problems of these funds that need to be addressed at some point. Yeah, they have to go to 501c3s. And I was having a conversation with someone recently, and I should have actually looked it up and put a link in here. There's a group that keeps a list of like bad nonprofits, right? Like essentially hate groups that are under the nonprofit umbrella. And not all nonprofits are good nonprofits and doing good things for the community. And if they exist, money from donor advised funds can go to them and go to the things that they're trying to accomplish. And the other question I generally have, again, is if the financial people are the ones saying, hey, create these funds, and then they're also responsible for where the funds go, are they qualified to help people understand where their funds really go and the benefit and the impact they can cause or not? So quickly, in 2023, the IRS proposed some new regulations. Like these were not laws that were coming out from the Senate or whatever. Like this was the IRS proposing some regulations to how it all fits within the tax code. And it was a really interesting thing. And I have the docket documents linked here if you wanted to look specifically and at all of the regulations that were in there. But essentially, the key issues were just clarifying and defining things. They weren't even really making much of a difference in anything, but they were just trying to create some better definitions around who and what is going on. Clarifying donor identity, potential changes in some of the tax benefits, clarifying rules around pledges, donor benefits, et cetera. They weren't even saying, hey, you have to spend your money by a certain amount, or hey, you have to spend so much of your money. None of that was even close to being proposed. But the response to these regulations was swift and angry some of the time. And they did some open hearings and pretty much all the people that showed up to speak on the issue were against it. And there was some significant funds that went into lobbying against these regulations through organizations like AFP, community foundations, of course, the financial institutions, because they all benefit from things existing the way that they do. And there's a lot of fear around what happens when I can't make money off of these funds anymore. And they showed up and they shared that. Although most of what they said was, if it gets harder for people to start and use these funds, less money will be going to the charities that need them. And that was overwhelmingly the theme without any evidence or data to support that claim at all. Interestingly, California tried to require DAF sponsoring organizations to report grant making activity of in each individual fund rather than the aggregate data, and that did not pass. So there are people, sorry about the thumbs up, there are people that want to keep things the way that they are because there's a financial gain to do that. So why does it matter to us, right? So more than grant writers, we're focused on the grant writing space. I assume there's a lot of other professionals here in the development and nonprofit world, leaders, development directors, et cetera. And it really does matter to all of us. It can, for those of us on the grant side, it can seem like it's a bit of a stretch, right? Like I write grants, I work with foundations, I work with private money, I work with the government. What do these dollars have to do with the work that I'm doing? Well, the trend in and of itself is something to at least pay attention to, because trends can become the way things happen. And some of my own experiences that made me start wondering about it are things like, hey, we just got a check from the Happy Foundation, and then the organization doesn't know what to do with that information. And I have to go figure out, oh, it looks like maybe this came from the community foundation. Okay, I work with a lot of organizations that don't have development teams, right? I am the only person in a development type of capacity. And so it becomes information I need to know to share that with the leadership and let them know, hey, maybe you can reach out to the community foundation and say, I'd like to thank this donor. Is there any way that I can get more information about them? Or one of the things that came out in those webinars that Chariot was putting on before DAF Day was saying, some of these funders don't even know they've become anonymous. Like, just ask. And I'm like, that's weird, right? Like, you don't know that people can't find you or know who you are behind the money, but apparently that's a thing. So maybe just ask to see if that's the case. Or, hey, a philanthropic advisor reached out to us and asked us to put a proposal together. I'm working with a client right now that happened to, and there are no guidelines, right? They have no application that they're starting from, and they're asking for some advice on strategy and what information goes on that. So that might end up on your desk as a grant professional saying, hey, we're supposed to put something together for this. I don't have any boundaries. What should it look like? And also just overall, when we're thinking about funding strategies and grants and individual donors and major gifts and events and all of the things that go into that big fundraising puzzle for an organization, if you aren't thinking we're talking about donor advised funds, overwhelmingly, people are telling you you're missing an opportunity to figure out where more dollars can come in the door. You know, maybe that $4,800 from an anonymous person could still create some benefit in your organization. So we have another poll question, if we're ready to launch that. We're curious how many of you have interacted with donor advised funds in whatever your capacity is. So I think it's up. Yeah, there we go. Oh, so we have folks have gotten a lot of donor advised funds. I was kind of surprised. I figured we'd be on the lower side. People who don't know. We have 29%, 27% people who don't know. One or two. It's kind of a little bit even across the board. That's interesting. Second question, if your organization has received contributions from a DAF, were the donors mainly anonymous? So the book there is some were from anonymous donors, some chose to disclose their names to us. Okay, good. Do I need to keep the polls up any longer? Are we good? All right. Another reason that it's relevant is that it really is essential for nonprofits seeking funds to understand what these dollars are, where they come from, who's managing them. Because it's really difficult stuff to piece together on your own. And what I'm finding is when you're looking for information on it, you have two camps. You have people that are like, this is a problem, and it's going to continue being a problem unless we do something as a country about it. And there's people who are like, this is one of the best things that's happened to philanthropy in a long time, right? The flexibility, the ease, it's going to get more people donating and more dollars into nonprofits. Right? Like I think there's a lot of middle ground. I think there's a lot of gray area between those two camps. And many DAF grants are donor initiated, meaning nonprofits need to be engaging where these funds are held to figure out how they can get them in the door, right? They are not doing open calls for you to show up. It is going to be like, what offices, what financial institution offices exist in my community? Who's in those roles? One of the clients that I'm working with, they don't want to talk to the financial person that reached out to them. They're afraid that they're going to create like a barrier to potentially getting more dollars. And my response is to them, we have to talk to somebody, right? We don't know who the donor is, fully anonymous. We have no idea who the person is. If we're talking about $1 million, we need to have more information about who we're talking to. And when I was talking to somebody at Schwab recently, her response is, it's our job, right? I am here in this position to kind of field those things. And doesn't mean that everyone's going to do their job really well. And it doesn't mean everyone's going to be welcoming of inquiries, but those jobs exist for a reason. And maybe we can help bridge those communication pieces so that access of these dollars is more widespread. And what could the next 10 years look like? I mean, we talked about what the past 10 years have been, the overwhelming trend that's been going on with these funds. We can probably predict that there's going to be continuing scrutiny of it from regulators and figuring out how regulations can or might come into play with them. That could very significantly be impacted by what happens in November and where our next administration goes about this. There could be, I I don't know, like this is a part where I would really love to hear your all's feedback about, just imagining what the future could look like. To me, when I think about it, and I think about more people saying, hey, I am going to go seek out these funds, that's going to create these sponsors to be like, okay, we're getting this overwhelming amount of inquiry about these sorts of things. Maybe we need to create a standard process that people go through. Maybe it ends up looking like a grant application because so many people need to tap into these funds that exist, because that's what they're there for, right? Like the amount of money sitting in charitable accounts overwhelmingly exceeds the amount of money that's actually transacted to nonprofits each year by like a lot. And it takes us on this end asking questions and poking a little bit and being like, I mean, how many of us are getting letters from funders saying, we appreciate your application and you have a great cause, we just don't have enough money to go around? There is enough money to go around. It exists. It exists untaxed. And it's sitting there, you guys. There is over $1 trillion in nonprofit or in charitable accounts. Trillion with a T. That's just sitting and not being used and growing in investment, right? And technology is going to play an important role too in the accessibility of these dollars. I want to see if anybody has any predictions. What are the predictions? What do we think the next 10 years? I think there are going to be fewer foundations because they don't want to deal with it. More money is going to be in donor advised funds. But I also think donor advised funds, the way that people are accessing it, is going to start gravitating more toward what we know as a traditional grant process to try and like maximize how all of this interaction happens. That's my, you can quote me on it, check back in 10 years, see if I was right. But I think some shifts are definitely on the horizon. Oh, and this is an interesting one that I wanted to throw in there. Dual functionality. So I got curious about, so could a working charity be a DAF sponsor? Legally, yes. Whether it's a good financial move, probably not. But what if that's something in the future? What if there's more community foundation style organizations that are also doing direct work? What if they sponsor DAFs, knowing that some of that money comes into their organization and can also be a collaborative effort, being like, we have a sponsor organization managing funds dedicated to maternal health, right? So if you care about maternal health, you can put your DAF money in here and we'll make sure it goes to the organizations in your community focused on maternal health. And we collectively can create this amazing impact with these dollars. That would be awesome. I think that would be super cool to see. And there's nothing legally keeping that from happening. Okay. So here we go. Q&A, a lot of information thrown at you. The goal of this was to get us all kind of on the same level of understanding, because again, when you're piecing these things together, depending on the source, it can lead you in one direction or another. And I'll tell you, having done this research, I started off I was against donor advised funds. I was reading all of the things from inequality.org. And while that's true, talking with people that work with people that have the wealth that they are interested in leveraging in charitable ways, they're just people, right? And the folks that I talk to, they're like good people. They just work for Morgan Stanley, right? And there's just gaps in people's understanding of how it all works together. And maybe grant professionals can be the ones showing up to these sponsor organizations and saying, hey, why don't you pay me to provide you with community data and information and research so that your sponsor staff people and your funders are really informed about where needs are and where their dollars can go, right? Like, might make that part of my business now. I don't know. But I think there's potential here for those of us on the not wealthy side that is trying to be adjacent to these funds, but know so much and have such richness and understanding of needs and community and the work that's being done to show up and start to educate and inform people that probably don't have as much access to that information as we do or aren't looking for it. So For our next session, it's going to get a little bit more on the concern side. We're going to have some more information that's really talking about the challenges and struggles and harms that come with these funds and how that they're transacted, but also really concrete things that we can do individually or as a group or within our organizations to be a part of the conversation, to share information when we have it, to speak up. If there's another proposed regulations, maybe we come as a group and we share our concerns against the people that are lobbying really heavily for or against something that's being proposed. Question. Can you say more about the DAF to DAF grants? Who benefits? Also, why would the AFP fight regs when DAFs make funders' jobs so much harder? Well, I don't, for AFP, I saw them on the lobby list. I saw the amount of money they dedicated to going against the regulations. I don't know where the decisions for that happened. It was on a global level. I'm not a part of AFP. There's certain reasons why. But I don't know that they asked everybody in AFP, hey, what do you think about this? Should we go and do some advocacy work? Or if it was decisions made by a few people who see the importance of major gifts coming out of these and other types of dollars that work toward nonprofits without really stopping to think there's some harm that comes along with it too. DAF to DAFs, because the sponsor is a 501c3, there's nothing legally that keeps me saying, hey, I'm going to move this money over here. And sometimes people or organizations or groups have a place for DAF funds to go within another DAF to figure out a way to get that money into an organization. Also, the thing about DAFs to DAFs, it also creates even more anonymity, right? So if you are somebody with significant funds and you are supporting things that you don't want people to know, you can move that money through donor advised funds. So it's really difficult to track and trace, and nobody can be like, hey, you just put $2 million toward this really terrible cause. I'm not going to support your company anymore. It can alleviate those kinds of things in that dark money side. Are there any questions or comments people want to come off of mute to ask or talk about before we have a couple more slides about some more than grant writer stuff, but this was the bulk of the information that I wanted to make sure we got to you. We also really want to hear what you want to learn more about, more in depth about for our second session. So please respond in the chat or let us know, what do you want us to dig in further? We have somebody else presenting for that session. She did a really amazing community-centric fundraising article about donor advised funds, which made us reach out and say, hey, will you come talk to our group? And we did this one to prep everybody to get to that point. So we were all coming from the same place. Logistical questions. Where are folks putting DAFs under in their revenue tracking and financials? Right, that's another one of the difficult things that I'm hearing from people is our systems aren't set up well at this point to track the difference in these funds very well. I know, grant management. Oh, that reminds me of the thing I wanted to show you. I know grant management stuff. I've been putting things in there for some of my organizations that don't really have another place to put it. But a lot of really important information can get lost along that. So for Lauren's question, like, where is everybody kind of, how are you tracking? How are you codifying these funds that are coming in? Feel free to answer her question in there. Someone does individual giving. I'm going to pop over my screen really quickly. I wanted to show you, I was in Instrumental yesterday. I was looking up a foundation and I was looking at who they had paid money to, and I saw something, I go, I bet that's a DAF. I bet they put this money into, like, a significant amount of money of their overall giving into a DAF. And I clicked on it and then I realized 501c3s have to fill out 990s, as we just discussed, and we can see some of that information. So here's an example of what I found in Schwab Charitable Trust. The Charles Schwab Corporation Foundation. And sometimes the name on their 990 is not the name that we know them in the community. So that's an important thing to know. But I can see that they have their assets, their total giving. Oh, no, that's not the one. Hold on. This one. Donor advised charitable giving. There, I was like, those assets look low. These are their assets. This is their total giving. And we can see where dollars have gone. Which I think, again, as it's relevant to grant professionals, and I can't speak for other development staff because I only do the grant side of things. But if our organization is starting to look more into this and wants a place to start to figure out who do I contact, what are we looking for, you might be someone who has access to databases that can start to lead them in a good direction. So, for example, I'm in Missouri, and I don't know how Foundation Directory Online looks at this, but as far as instrumental goes, I can see throughout Missouri where donor advised funds have gone, and I can see where big dollars have gone, and I can be curious, I wonder how they got those. And maybe I have a connection to someone in that organization, and maybe I can reach out and be like, hey, where did that come from? And I can maybe go to a local Schwab office in my area and say, hey, I was looking around and saw that people care about Animal Protective Association, right? Like, I have an organization that works for against animal cruelty. And here's a one pager of my information. If you have donors that are interested in that thing, I would be appreciated if you sent this on. There's potentially a starting place here that I never thought to look at. And as a grant professional, you might be the one that can help get some of that information started. So you can also see how big these dollars are. Right? Like, this isn't $5,000 grants we're talking about. This is, well, the archdiocese. So a lot of money goes to religion, and people use donor advised funds for their religious giving, right? Their tithing or whatever. They know every year I'm going to give $10,000 to my church. Might as well put that in a donor advised fund and then pay my church through donor advised fund. So there's a lot of money that goes through that way too. Okay. So again, you have access to this information. We'll send it out again by email. We also have a resource page on our website. If you haven't checked it out, it's still there. It's wonderful. Please use it. And then part 2, November 18th at 11 a.m. Pacific time. So that's 1 Central time. Abigail O'Doul will be coming. And her article is linked there that we were referencing before. We have the registration link here. We'll send it out again in an email to figure out, okay, what's really going on here and what can we do about it. I'm going to move past this. I know you guys have access to this. Also coming up for More Than Grant Writers, Leanne, who's another More Than Grant Writer folk, and myself and 2 other people, we have grant work as advocacy and activism at the GPA Summit. It's a virtual session. So if you're joining virtually, we hope you join us. Isabel, who's another More Than Grant Writers team member, she's presenting live Joyride or Roller Coaster about consulting. We're always open to feedback. So there's places that you can share with us what information you want to know from us. And I think that's it. Are there any questions, comments that anybody wants to leave with us? Thanks again for everybody that joined. And you're out a little bit early. Look at that.